On April 14th, Vice President Mike Pence embarked on a 10-day tour of Asia. If he cuts it short, you know we're about to bomb North Korea.
You don't have to be poor anymore. Jesus is here.
The loudspeaker spoke up and said, Christianity is stupid.
Greetings, awesome worker slaves, podcasting at 128 kilobits from the Fortress of Squalitude, located 40 miles from the Redneck Mecca. This is the Atheist in the Trailer Park podcast, Patreon edition. I'm your host, Tucker. Professor Fuzznuts is curled up asleep somewhere. Yes, it's a podcast hosted by a guy and his cat. Get over it. This is where I reward the people who've agreed to pay me money by posting the crap I thought wasn't good enough to be in a regular episode. Or, in this case, Patreon listeners are getting an advance preview of the episode that I'm going to be posting while I'm coming back from ReasonCon. As always, I'm supremely pressed for time, so what I thought I'd do is cut an episode that was inspired by a couple of different podcasts I heard recently, as well as some things that I've read and recent events. Upload it this week for the Patreon supporters, then next week post it for the regular listeners. Don't worry, folks, you won't be charged for this episode, as I'll only be sticking it in the Patreon only feed and then the normal feed for iTunes. I'll have links to the podcast which inspired this in the show notes, and I'm not really sure of how to start talking about all of them, as they were sort of just mushed up in my head, rubbing up against one another. One of the podcasts I've mentioned before is the All Politics is Social episode of My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. That's sort of the underpinning of much of this, along with Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. I don't know if Bruce Carlson has read Hoffer's book, but based on his comments in that episode, he certainly seems familiar with the concepts discussed in it. One of the things that Carlson mentions is that Trump is a master at making an outrageous statement which completely detracts from everything else going on at the moment. Sort of like how people were bashing Trump for his address to Congress, and then suddenly he starts tweeting that his phones had been tapped by Obama. People forget about what he said during the speech and focus on his tweets. The way our media, indeed the way we humans are structured, is that we're more inclined to pay attention to the person saying the outrageous statements than we are people making reasonable statements, or even ones that are just as false but aren't couched in such language. Every Sunday, thousands of preachers get in front of their congregations and spin falsehoods. They'll quote misogynistic, homophobic, or other horrible Bible passages, but they'll sort of gloss over what the passage is talking about, and everybody just ignores it. When someone like Kevin Swanson comes out and says, "Let's kill the gays," or that women should be content to just push out babies and clean house, everybody loses their goddamned minds. Swanson isn't saying anything different than those other pastors. He's just putting it out there, naked, like the lunch at the end of your fork. To fight all that, you either need someone incredibly charismatic and smart, or you need to be able to counter it with some kind of equally outrageous comment. Hence the title of this episode, Sean Spicer is a Sheep Pimp. It's outrageous, funny, and unlike the kind of crap spewed by Spicer, only a fool would take it seriously. However, it does get one noticed. It enables one to steer the conversation in a different direction, because now no one's talking about what Spicer said, but what you said and the other things that you said. An online friend of mine put it succinctly when he said, "But all of this fits the general policy of the Trump administration. Let them call us insane. Let them be outraged about all the bullshit we spout every day. As long as the barrage of insanity is unrelenting, substantial political criticism remains unrecognizable. In other words, they want an incredibly bad press secretary, and once they inevitably sacrifice this pawn, they'll need to come up with an equally bad replacement or something else to fuck up communication beyond repair. It might sound awful that we'd end up with two sides saying crazy shit about one another, but when that happens, someone making reasonable comments becomes the one who stands out. You also don't have to respond to every batshit comment, because what they crave is attention. And as I've said before, if sunlight really was the best disinfectant, then Donald Trump wouldn't be president. Yes, if you ignore them, they'll say even crazier things, but they'll be doing that anyway since they feed off the attention of others, and once they're handed a platform, they'll spout just as much crazy shit as they would have otherwise. Now, I'm not saying we should ignore all the insanity spouted by the nutters, just that we should be selective in what we respond to, as well as try to carefully craft our responses so that they hit people in a way they weren't expecting, or they keep another issue on the table. So when talking about Trump dropping the Moab on Afghanistan, saying something like Alex Jones told Trump it would stop the lizard aliens, or that it was what Putin suggested, this undercuts the narrative pushed by the White House and much of the media while redirecting the conversation in a different direction. In an episode of the Intercepts podcast, Glenn Greenwald inadvertently highlights another problem with people's thinking. He rails against Democrats in Congress who criticize Trump for not taking a tougher stand on Putin's ally, Assad of Syria. Now that Trump's done an ineffective strike against Syria, Greenwald claims that all the Democrats can do is support Trump on this. That shows a limited range of thought on his part, even if he is correct that Democrats have praised Trump for the bombing. He neglects to mention that it's entirely possible to call Trump out for not doing enough about Assad while not supporting the recent attack on the Syrian airfield. That requires taking a nuanced position on things, something few people are willing to do. Now, if Assad never uses chemical weapons again, this strike can be considered a success. But until he is removed from power, there's no way to be certain that he won't use such weapons again. Given the fact that the runway was back in operation a short time later and Assad still in power, the strike, at best, can be considered to be of limited success. Remember, the raid didn't target any of the suspected stockpiles of chemical weapons, as the concern was that this could release the gas and kill more innocent civilians. So Assad still has weapons he can use. Will he? I don't know. I do know, however, that having a broader perspective on the issue can only help understand matters and lead to more effective actions. Granted, this isn't something that the general public is going to want to take an interest in. After all, when the media is showing them pictures of missiles being launched, with reporters like Brian Williams calling them beautiful, and even going so far as to quote a line from a Leonard Cohen song, "I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons," it's hard for most people to think objectively about the subject, and Cohen, who was a Buddhist, almost certainly would have been appalled at both the missile launches and Williams quoting it. Until folks can find a way to make things like social work as sexy as a missile launch, it's going to be an uphill climb to get them to respond objectively to the U.S. bombing anyway. After all, most people think, we blowed him up real good, problem solved. That is, in fact, not the case at all. You might have stopped a particular group of people, but that doesn't mean you've solved the problems which led to the creation of that group of people, or haven't inspired more people to take up arms against you. We have to find a way to refocus people's attentions during such times to the consequences of such actions and the costs associated with them. Quoting from Eisenhower's The Chance for Peace speech, which goes in part,
"Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is, I repeat, the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
Is a good place to start. This is one of those areas where Eisenhower is an impeachable source on the subject. Not only was he Republican president, but he was also a military leader who saw firsthand the destruction wrought by 2 world wars and the concentration camps. With the escalating cost of weapons, I'm sure that his figures are way off in modern terms, but his point is still a valid one. As is raising the issue that Trump cares enough about the children dying in Syria to blow up an airfield, but doesn't care enough about the children in Syria to let them in the country. Another thing that all of us must do is to point out the good that comes from the government. The interstate system, the internet, and hell, most of modern technology comes from government-funded research. Bruce Carlson starts the episode of the podcast I mentioned by playing an ad done by the U.S. government during the Great Depression, which explains a government program to the listeners. It's hokey as all fuck, but it's something which the government has failed to do under even Democratic presidents like Clinton and Obama. We know such things would work today because there's any number of scam artists out there running ads on the internet telling people that Obama or Trump has signed a bill which allows people to get help with their mortgages, and all they need to do is give their personal information to the scam artists and they'll soon have all the money they need. When I was a kid, there used to be commercials on TV all the time that talked about the Consumer Information Catalog, published by the government, and you just wrote Consumer Catalog, Pueblo, Colorado, 81009. I'm going to pause and check that. Yep, just checked, and sure enough, even though I haven't seen one of those commercials in probably 20 years or more, I did get the fucking zip code right. And I've never seen a web ad for that ever that I can recall. But I certainly remember those bizarre commercials they did in the 70s. Of course, it's obvious why there's no more ads for that, because it tells people that the government is doing something for them, and it makes it harder to claim that all your tax dollars are being wasted. Funny how all those people who talk about government waste don't mind spending money on things like weapons of war, even when those weapons don't work correctly or cost more than cheaper alternatives. Now, I'm not saying that you should necessarily remind people of all the things made possible by the government when they bash the government. That's a good way to start an argument. But if you drop such comments when they're least expecting them, they'll be caught off guard and will be unlikely to have a response which they can unthinkingly call up. In 1984, the character of Harold Syme says, "The secret's to move from translation to direct thought to automatic response. No need for self-discipline, language coming from the throat, here, not from the brain, here." That's what things like Fox News do to people. It gives them a pre-programmed answer to issues as they come up. If you try to engage people at a time, and in a manner they expect, you're unlikely to make much headway with them. Catch them off guard, and your comment will float around in their head while their brain tries to find a comforting response. for most people, there's no difference between politics and religion, at least in terms of thought that they've put into it. They don't have an original idea in their head on the subject. They just regurgitate what they've been told all their lives and pat themselves on the back for being clever. Which leads me to my next subject, and this is where the smooshing of all the ideas talked about in the various podcasts I've mentioned blurs to the point where I can't separate them out. It also incorporates various things I've read over the years. One of the ways that religion makes itself so sticky in people's heads, even after they've left religion, is because of how tirelessly it works to put itself into people's lives, and the easy tools it gives people to look towards religion instead of something more effective. Prayer, for example. Instead of actually doing something or even thinking about a subject, religion teaches people that they just have to pray and God will solve all their problems. Now, granted, when you're dealing with someone who's having health problems, there's nothing that atheism can offer which is easier than prayer in a lot of cases. However, Googling doesn't take much more work than praying does and can actually yield productive results. Telling someone that you're going to Google and see if you can't find something to help them not only gives you something potentially productive to do in that situation, but reminds that other person of the fact that we have incredible tools at our disposal to help one another. Additionally, since prayer gives something people to do to calm their minds when they're stressed, teaching people relaxation techniques to use in times of stress undercuts the strength of prayer in their minds. We really ought to have little cards with breathing exercises printed on them that we can leave scattered about like the religious do with all their little tracts. We know that a large number of Americans, some estimates put it as high as 25% or even higher, don't really have a deep-seated religious belief, but follow religion more out of habit than anything else. Something like those cards might make it easier for them to slough off the last vestiges of their religious beliefs. And here's something for the folks listening who have kids. When I was little, when we sat down to eat dinner, Mom always had to read us a story from some goddamn religious book for kids. I'm sure I'm not alone in this. How many atheist parents out there read their kid a science-related story before you have dinner? By doing so, you'll be exposing your kid to science and getting them to think scientifically about something. If your kid asks you a question, like, why is the sky blue? Don't give them the answer, even if you know it, but say, let's see what science says about that. If they ask you a history question, say, let's see what historians have to say on the subject, and so on. You're teaching them to look for answers to questions, and unlike religious people who would program their kids to pray or look to the Bible to answer their questions, you're not only educating your children, but you're giving them the skills to educate themselves and ingraining that behavior so they'll be less likely to fall for bullshit in the future. And hell, it doesn't have to be a science story that you read to your kids at dinner. It could be a news story, an article on critical thinking, or even a children's book that supports a skeptical viewpoint. Things like propaganda work because of repetition. If you see more flyers saying that freedom is slavery than you do ones saying that freedom means an end to slavery, your subconscious is going to glom onto the idea that freedom is slavery and kick that out at you at certain moments, even if you know all the arguments against such a notion. By priming your kid with science and facts, you help fight against that. And by putting science and facts out there more, you help fight against that. I'm sure all of you who were raised religious have experienced some vestige of this since becoming atheist. There's that great meme which goes something like,
because I was raised Catholic, whenever I hear someone say, may the force be with you, I instantly respond with, and also with you.
That's no accident. Because religion works to hammer into people's heads rote responses to certain comments. Anything which resembles those comments elicits that pre-programmed response. That goes back to Syme's statement of language coming from the throat, not the brain. If you're a musician and you have a fondness for certain religious hymns, if they're in the public domain, rewrite the lyrics so that they reflect a skeptical/scientific/atheistic viewpoint. Record it and release it on iTunes using a service like CD Baby. And let me know. Even if I can't afford to buy it, I'll be happy to pimp it on my podcast. And I could probably get a few other atheists to pimp it on their podcasts as well. I, for one, would love to have a version of Amazing Grace that has lyrics which reference the space program. It'd make that scene where they fire Spock into space at the end of the Wrath of Khan, spoiler alert, all that more poignant. Not that I need to bawl any more at that scene than I already do, but at least I'd be crying to a song whose lyrics were somewhat relevant to the scene. One of those things which was lost when mass media began spreading the poisonous peanut butter of a smooth, homogeneous society across America were the kinds of tools that individuals used to provide themselves with support. Unions used to have all kinds of songs that members could sing to entertain themselves, to comfort themselves, and to express themselves. Above all, those songs drove home in the mind of the person singing the song what the union stood for and why they were putting life and limb at risk for it. Utah Phillips and Annie DeFranco did a couple albums of union songs together. I'll have a link to the one I'm familiar with in the show notes. It's worth listening to. Utah Phillips also gives some of the stories around those songs as well on the album. Because of things like the internet, we're starting to see things like that happen again, especially in geek circles, but there needs to be a conscious effort on our part to do more things like that. For every place where someone would be inclined to reach for religion, even if they're no longer religious, we have to have something to offer them instead. As skeptics, atheists, humanists, or whatever we choose to call ourselves, we need to make it easy for people to be atheists. We need to make sure that phrases like, "What does the science say?" fall from our lips as easily and frequently as, "What does the Bible say?" falls from the lips of Christians. One other thing that religions do, which we do not, as yet, have a parallel in our side of the column, for the most part, is they have a religious figure they can wave about for almost any occasion. The Catholics are particular masters of this with all their various saints. Got cancer? Pray to Saint Peregrine Laziosi. Blind? Pray to Saint Lucy. We need to be dropping the names of scientists/skeptics/humanitarians with equal ease in such situations. Hitchens was pretty public with how he was dealing with his cancer and would be a good person to refer someone to if they were dying of cancer. Marie Curie also died of cancer caused by her work with things like radium. She'd be another person to mention. I wasn't able to find anything in a quick Google flail about scientists who survived cancer, but then again, scientists aren't generally celebrities in our society. We need to change that. For the blind, the obvious choice is Helen Keller, Ray Charles. If you want a scientist working in the field, then Robert McLaren, a British scientist who's developed a promising treatment for some forms of blindness, would be a good choice. Does it sound crazy? I don't know, but it's nowhere near as crazy as praying to a dead guy on a stick is, and it will actually better people's lives. We all agree that you're better off looking to science than you are to religion. So just like the Christians are constantly extolled to be more Christ-like, we should be more scientific in our actions. And to do this, we need to seize every opportunity we can to share science, atheism, skepticism, logic, and reason with people. Those of us who live in areas where it wouldn't necessarily be healthy to be open can still do this without worrying about putting our necks on the line. Wear a NASA t-shirt, or one with Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, or some other scientist on it, or a philosopher, or an artist. Sure, it might not be as hip as having a tour shirt from your favorite band, but it'll send a message to people. It'll get them thinking about something other than religion. And if someone religious comes up to you and points out that Bill Nye is an atheist, just tell them you're more interested in his work with the Planetary Society or educating kids than you are in his lack of religious beliefs. In one of Joseph Campbell's books, he talks about how a church is structured to impress upon people the power of religion and the power of God, so that it's imbued in them even on the subconscious level. I think it was on The Power of Myth with Bill Moyers where he really talks about this. But he's talking about the chapel at Notre Dame and how the priest of the chapel sleeps in a bed where, when he wakes up in the morning, the first things he sees is a stained glass window with a religious symbol on it. Now, we need to do things like that as well. Hang a poster of Carl Sagan up, so when you wake up in the morning, the first thing you see is Sagan, or Newton, or somebody else. I realize that most of us can't afford to build our house in such a way that it reflects science and skepticism and things like that. But there are elements that we can all do that will help reinforce that concept in us, as well as put the idea in other people. One of the things that I'm going to do that is a surprising benefit of my job, after I did a little nudging, assuming, of course, I can get the help with this that I need, we, at work, we throw out this huge amount of lumber. Nothing wrong with it, but it's used to package certain materials that we use at work. And we just throw it out. Now, we save a small portion of it to repackage some of the stuff that we're shipping out, but the bulk of it goes in the dumpster. Now, for months, I've been looking at that going, God, that is such a waste. Such a waste. I need to be, we need to find something to do with that. And then, probably because warm weather's rolled around and I like having a garden, but I don't have many time. So, I wanted to put in raised garden beds. And, of course, I can't afford to buy anything. And then one day when I was slinging that wood to the side, into the dumpster, I was like, why don't I see if they can let me have this shit? So I went and I asked, and they said they'd get back to me, and I gave them a week, and then I went and bugged them again, and they came back and they said, well, you can have all of it, but this part that we have to package up our shit. Now, it's all weird looking, it's all kind of odd shaped, but I can build a raised garden bed with it. What I'm going to do, because this actually I will be able to afford to do, because it's not terribly expensive, I think, and it probably won't cost me much more than $40 or so. I'm going to take that scrap wood, build a raised bed, and then, because we don't have easily visible house numbers in the area, I'm going to put, it's kind of hard to describe. You can, there's this design of a solar fountain that I saw that was really cool. I can't afford to do that, but it was roughly the size, or roughly the shape of the monolith from 2001, right? So tall rectangle, and then it had a slit across the front of it, and water came out in a fountain. Looks really neat. Solar-powered water fountain pumps are dirt cheap, but copper sheeting's way too expensive. That's fine. I can get some aluminum flashing metal, which I'll need anyways, to take care of some things around the house, to make it out of. And then I'll put my house numbers there, and I will put something which doesn't obviously seem to be related to science, but actually is. I take my name from the Tucker automobile. I will have a stencil of a Tucker automobile on there. Now, I know what you're going to say. What the hell's that going to do? Guarantee you, after I put that up, when I'm outside, somebody's going to stop and say, what's that car on there? I can then tell them about Preston Tucker. And yes, it is science related because Preston Tucker, and I will not go on for hours about this like I can, was a automotive pioneer who was one of the first people to push safety in automobiles, wanted to have a car that would have, had he had the resources to build the car the way he wanted, it would have been more fuel efficient than anything on the road back then. Probably still respectable fuel efficiency standards for today. Additionally, it would have had very low emissions because of the design. And the emissions would have been low enough that at least until the early 80s, it wouldn't have needed much of the smog equipment that other cars had. The simple explanation as to how he was going to build the car was it was going to be the original design, not the one that he did get built before he got shut down, but the original design, it was going to have what can best be thought of as a hydraulic hybrid setup. As a hybrid car has a gasoline engine that charges up batteries which then power the wheels. This was going to have a gasoline powered engine that charged up a hydraulic pump that powered the wheels. Forklifts use this today, and there is a company in in Colorado called Lightning Hybrids who convert fleet vehicles over to that technology. So it's practical. He just wasn't able to pull it off for a variety of complicated reasons that I will not go into because you're not listening to this because it's a podcast about the automobile. It's a podcast about atheism, science, skepticism, and whatever the hell else I find interesting at the moment. But my point is I can use that to educate him not only on the car, but on things that are outside the mainstream view. Gives me a wedge in. Somebody could do something like that. Put fucking, what is it? But, and I'll post, when I get this thing done, assuming I'm actually able to find the time to do it all, and I get somebody to haul the stuff for me, I'll put pictures of it on the website, but you can, you could put something else up there, you could put Einstein up there, you could put the Voyager space probe. Ooh, not that I could do it in this neighborhood, but put the naked man and women from the plaque on Voyager. But there's all kinds of things you can do like that. One of the things that I've wanted to do if I ever had the money, and one of the ideas rumbling around in my head is, and I've actually sketched some of the stuff out, is model playground equipment after things in the space program. So, the kids can play in an Apollo capsule, or a space shuttle, or a replica of Skylab, or, they have a Mars rover they can play on. Things like that. But I don't have the time, but I have the yard or the kids, so it doesn't really matter. But things like that, doing things like that, puts science out there and hits kids at an important age. Because, I'm an old fucker. I'm gonna die. It keeps coming home to me all the time. All these musicians that I grew up listening to aren't that much older than me, and they're now dying. I listened to Jay Giles' band in middle school. He died this past week. He was 71. I'm 49 almost. He's not that much older than me. I got a narrow window. But we do things for the kids and we shift society, because by the time I'm a doddering old man in a nursing home, it's the kids today that are going to be looking after me. If we've provided them with the tools in this world, because God knows the government under Trump isn't going to do it, then we stand a chance. And even flipping somebody who's old, towards things can help if they vote. Forget trying to talk an 80-year-old person out of their religious beliefs. It's not worth it. If they vote Republican, shifting them to vote Democratic or Green Party or whatever, anything but Republican, is a big help, because the elderly are the people most likely to vote. And if, and the other thing is by seeing something that, hey, the space program, it's an Apollo playhouse. It gets people thinking about the shit that the government used to do. It gnaws away at them. And it can get them thinking about, why don't we do that now? What caused these things to stop being done? I mean, of course, some of them are going to look at, that thing was big way of government money. Went to the moon, all we got was a bunch of rocks. You're not going to reach that person. But the unreachable people are going to be in the minority. And what I mean by that is, according to surveys, 20% of Republicans will never vote for a Democrat. 20% of Democrats will never vote for a Republican. That means on any political issue, you have 20% of the population who are unmovable. Now, if we, and I know this is wrong, we split the number of Republicans and Democrats evenly in the country and say that, out of the 320 million Americans, 160 million of them are Republicans and 160 million of them are Democrats. Out of those, less than half the population can be shifted on an issue that they hold near and dear to their heart. And actually, the number is probably significantly lower, because while you might not be able to get a Republican, a hard-nosed Republican to vote for a Democrat, you almost certainly can get them switched on an issue so that they pressure their Republican leaders to support that issue in the same manner. But it takes being clever. It takes knowing how to frame the argument, knowing how to hit them when they're not looking. And it also takes the subtle cues that I've talked about. Because, again, that's how religion works. They have subtle, they pull off a subtle cues. So when you see, say, the Coca-Cola logo, you don't necessarily think of Coca-Cola, you think of Jesus. Because you've seen all those people with the Jesus Christ logo written in the Coca-Cola script. I wonder if somebody would get sued for doing the Carl Sagan in that script. If Coke would sue them, or if Sagan's widow would sue them. I don't know about that. That's an interesting idea. Coke certainly wouldn't go after the religious side because, well, that's bad PR. Can't have that. They got enough of that already. But they might go after somebody using Sagan's name, or Andrewian, that's Sagan's widow, might do it. Of course, she could probably be bribed if you said, hey, we'll donate a portion of the profits to the Planetary Society, which Sagan helped to found. Okay, I've got a shit ton of things I need to do today, so I'm going to have to stop now. I will, however, leave you with something we in the community can say in place of the kind of religious farewells many of us probably grew up with. May science and reason help you solve all your problems.
That's it for this episode of The Atheist in the Trailer Park Podcast. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, as well as just about anywhere else podcasts can be found. Many of the episodes are also on YouTube. Follow the show on Twitter. @TParkAtheist is the show's Twitter handle. It's on Facebook at facebook.com/trailerparkatheist.com. If you happen to like the podcast, please rate it on iTunes. If you'd like to support the podcast, there's a donate button on the show notes page. You can support it via Patreon at patreon.com/TNTucker. Thanks for listening.
Say goodnight, Fuznuts.
All I know is this violates every canon of respectable broadcasting.
Damned cat.